Hello, everyone. Welcome to BWS Dialogues, the new podcast from Brandwidth Solutions. I'm Laura Bush, the Senior Director of Content Marketing here at Brandwidth. And today I have the pleasure of talking with Gil Roth, the President of PBOA, the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. Gil founded PBOA in 2014 to advocate for the regulatory, legislative, and business interests of the CDMO sector. Gil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today we're going to talk about the recent executive order that instructs the ASPR, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, to fill the Strategic Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients Reserve. So Gil, how does this plan build on or differ from previous stockpiling efforts by the U.S. government?
Well, this is the first real API reserve. It was sort of established in the previous administration, but this is the first order to actually fill it. It's got complications, as most executive orders do. First being that executive orders can't supersede law, which is passed by Congress. Executive orders come from the executive branch or the White House. The Strategic API Reserve, as the EO, the executive order, puts it, first mandates the establishment of a critical medicines list, which would be a winnowing out or further refining of the essential medicines list that HHS, or Department of Health and Human Services, put out in 2020. There's a Department of Defense version of that that's narrower. The original essential meds is about, I think, 240 drugs that are considered essential. Department of Defense narrowed that, and ASPR is going to narrow that, according to this EO, to approximately 26. How they came up with approximate and a fixed number like that, I don't know, but approximately 26 drugs that are critical to U.S. public health. And as part of the EO goes, they would then try to basically source API for those 26 meds. Now, the preference would be for U.S.-based manufacturers for those meds, for those APIs. We don't know what the list is yet. They have a few more days to establish what that is. They were given 30 days according to the executive order from August 13th when the EO came out. So the preference is for American suppliers. There are not a lot of American suppliers for a lot of more of the commodity APIs, which this will probably lean toward. So chances are they're going to have to source from non-US locations. Now, the idea is that APIs will have a longer shelf life than the finished dosage form. So they want to hold these as APIs and then, when needed, make the finished dosage form of these meds in case there's a crisis. There's not a whole lot in the executive order about replenishment, given that these things will eventually expire, nor a complication that came up when we mentioned the executive order to our member companies, which was there may not be licensed manufacturers of the finished dosage forms of those critical medicines based in the US. So you may have the APIs in storage here, but you may not have any companies with facilities that are permitted by FDA to actually make these drugs into their final form. A further complication of that is you may have companies that are licensed to make those finished dosage forms, but are not licensed to use the particular API sources that are there. The reason this is a complication is, it's an anecdote I've told for years. One of my CDMO members told me many, many years ago, they made oral solid dosage drugs for a client. And after years of doing it, the tablets started disintegrating when they shouldn't have. The rate was terrible. They kept asking the client, did you change anything? We don't see any change on our side. They brought in the tablet whisperer who looked over all the equipment and machinery they had, couldn't find anything wrong. After the third or fourth round of this, the customer finally said, well, I mean, we changed the API supplier, but it's the same API, so that shouldn't be a problem. This, of course, was the problem. So if there are finished dosage form makers in the US who can make that drug but have not worked with that particular API supplier before, you may find critical medicines that are disintegrating, falling apart, and essentially useless. So there are a lot of complications beyond the big splash of, hey, let's go buy a lot of APIs and, establish US independence in case of a crisis. And that's a sign of all the all the operational stuff that people don't think about. And that everything that goes into pharma manufacturing is a lot more complicated than Buy American, because there are things that can go wrong drastically with this sort of stuff. So that's the API reserve executive order and some of the potential ramifications of it. It is of a piece with the administration's push to have more domestic manufacturing, although again, the order says, when possible to source US. Also, this is all contingent on funds being available to do this, which nobody's quite sure where the funding would come from. So there are a lot of caveats within that executive order, but they do fit into the larger perspective of this administration on how to use executive power, largely through White House orders, through to HHS and FDA, to try to build on domestic manufacturing. And some of that includes working with Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, and other branches of the government to find ways to either incentivize domestic manufacturing or penalize non-US manufacturing.
Hmm. Wow. And when you talk about the funding, are you talking simply about whether or not there will be enough funding to actually purchase these APIs, or were you talking about a broader issue?
Yeah, no, that's in the executive order. If funding permits, acquire 6 months or however many months of these APIs, without mentioning where the funding would come from. And the funding typically is allocated by Congress for something like this, and an executive order doesn't try to. An executive order essentially does things in an extra congressional way, with the caveat that it will not supersede anything Congress actually enacts.
Right. So, what do you think will be the impact of this order on CDMOs or pharma manufacturing broadly, or CDMOs, either in the short term or the long term?
I think, again, it'll fit into the larger landscape of executive orders and policy decisions by the administration to try to push for more domestic manufacturing. And we see that in early May, there was an executive order on incentivizing domestic drug manufacturing, which had a number of ways to try to streamline the process to get approvals to build. Doesn't tackle some of the key issues that CDMOs face when it comes to building something new, which we're still working with the administration in various ways to try to get them to understand and to figure out ways around the catch-22 of a CDMO building a new facility, which I can talk about further on. But we look at this in alignment with the executive orders as well as the current tariff policy and the pending, at this point, tariff probe into pharma supply chains. This is called a Section 232 investigation. The administration did these separately from the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which is what drove most of the tariff policy that the administration is currently pursuing. Section 232's focus on individual sectors like steel and aluminum, car parts, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. So there's an investigation was initiated in April. Anybody's feedback was due by the beginning of May. PBOA contributed to the responses. About 950 different entities responded to the investigation. When I met with Department of Commerce last month, they were still working on the set of recommendations. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to recommend tariffs, but they can at least assess what the landscape looks like for the pharma supply chain, what the administration should do to try to strengthen U.S. supply chains. Now, whether that involves tariffs or regulatory, tax code, and financial incentives, as we recommended, remains to be seen. It has been something that industry has been waiting on extensively. Some of the complications around it, as the administration has made tentative trade pacts with particularly Europe and Japan, they have agreed that tariffs on pharmaceutical products will not exceed the baseline tariff for those two regions, which is 15%, 1-5. Now, we don't know what the Section 232 recommendations are going to entail. We know that in addition to that 15% cap on pharmaceutical tariffs, the administration in these other regions also agreed to essentially zero out tariffs on generic APIs and generic finished dosage forms imported into the US from EU or Japan. That's critical because those generics are so insanely price sensitive in the US that a significant hit on of tariffs on their APIs or importation of dosage form could lead to significant shortages. So it seems the administration is aware of that. And that's been some of the latest tariff policy. They put out a further executive order on harmonized tariff schedule codes that seems to, maybe depending on how you read it, exempt generic products from being hit with significant tariffs that are levied on any individual country. So that's a big bifurcation when it comes to understanding the impact of tariffs and what they're going to do to pharma and to CDMOs. The innovator side is one thing and the generic side is another. Our members cover both of those. They cover large and small molecule, generic and innovator, et cetera. If you are trying to move generic API manufacturing to the US, you face a lot of challenges because the economics of that sector are so tight that US healthcare, environmental, and other costs can really drive up the price of manufacturing such that a wholesaler may say, even with the tariffs, we'd rather get that from India or, another country. It'll still be less expensive to do that. So seeing how that's going to pan out is one thing. On the innovator side, we have seen significant announcements of investments in the US, both in-house pharma, as Lilly and other companies have announced tens of billions of dollars in domestic investment, as well as expanded work with CDMOs in the US. Two in particular have come up in recent months. Regeneron and Johnson & Johnson have both announced that they would be increasing the amount they're spending with Fujifilm biotech in, I believe, North Carolina, in that particular campus, in the billions. They've announced these expanded contracts with that company. They're framing that as increasing their domestic manufacturing. They're increasing manufacturing that is being done domestically. It's just not being done by those two companies. It'll be done by Fujifilm instead. But there's a lot of moving of goalposts that have occurred when it comes to policy and what onshoring means to the US and to other countries for sure.
Wow. Yeah, and just to kind of take a little bit further the conversation about the difficulty of bringing generic drug manufacturing back to the United States. I mean, even we're talking about APIs, but if we trace it back further to key starting materials, for generics, the vast majority of those come from China, right?
Largely from China. And then there's the area that everybody forgets to talk about that our friend Marta Washinska at the Brookings Institute was very good at highlighting in recent years, the role of excipients. The stuff that's not an active ingredient in all these oral solids and in other drugs, the excipient materials do not tend to come from the U.S. There are some US-based manufacturers specifically of like functional excipients and sort of higher end chemicals, but largely excipients are very, very important to the pharma industry, but the pharma industry is not a super large component of a lot of excipient makers' businesses because a lot of them are food grade companies and they're selling a much larger volume to food companies and feed than they are to pharma. So while it's super important to the pharma sector, it probably is not going to move the needle enough for any of those companies to say, oh, yeah, let's put a facility in the US and start charging 10 times what we were charging in Brazil or elsewhere to make these excipients. So that's another component, again, where people who don't know how everything comes together come up with a policy that, is perfectly targeted at one thing without realizing there's a whole lot of other things that need to be considered and amended.
Absolutely. So you brought up that one of the bigger goals here is to bring pharmaceutical manufacturing and more of it back to the United States. And that you mentioned that there have been several measures. So there's been you mentioned the executive order from reducing the time to approve manufacturing plants. There's the pre-check program, the Equipa Pharma program. I'd like to just dive into each one of those a little bit more and hear your thoughts on how they impact or could impact, trying to achieve that goal and what those gaps and challenges might be. So
Sure. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
no, I was going to say, so I think you already kind of touched on the first one of that executive order from May. So that was about instructing the FDA to reduce the amount of time it takes to approve domestic manufacturing plants and also increasing fees and inspections for foreign facilities. So what do you see as the potential impact of that measure?
Well, that's the FDA commissioners talked repeatedly about increasing unannounced foreign inspections, not just foreign inspections, um, which is seen as a leveling of the playing field, that U.S. sites are subject to unannounced drop-in inspections by FDA, foreign ones are not. From the work we have done with FDA over the course of several user fee negotiations, specifically for GDUFA, but also the generic drug user fees, but also for the over-the-counter monograph ones, or OMUFA, there are reasons that overseas inspections get announced, especially depending on the region. There are logistical issues related to going to, we'll say, provinces in China where you need to inspect some of these sites that involve handlers, basically booking hotels, getting State Department clearance, finding translators. All of those things you can try to do on the sly if you were going to do an unannounced inspection, but chances are somebody's going to say, oh, hey, we just heard somebody from the US government's trying to get a translator for this particular region. We're going to assume it's an FDA inspection and tell every site in that area to start, prepping for that. There are also regions that are dangerous. We were filled in the GDUFA 2 negotiations about 10 years ago on the State Department involvement and training that's required for inspectors going into certain regions because of the potential for hazardous conditions. So there are, while it's great to say we're going to just start showing up and inspecting everywhere, there are reasons why it's good to lay the groundwork first in a way that is going to signal to your inspectorate who you're actually going to see. Still, there should be more overseas inspections. We saw a real drop in that during COVID, of course, as all inspectors were grounded. And then beyond that, when China was still in that COVID zero policy, there was very little entry allowed. So inspections dropped even further. There's an effort to increase that now, but there are always tensions with the US and Chinese government, how those could play out in terms of how inspectors are treated, could create caution. Beyond that, the FDA has also had significant turnover within the inspectorate, and they really have to staff up in that space. And training within the inspectorate requires 12 to 18 months before an inspector is really qualified to inspect a facility. So there's going to be a lag, even if they want to start, really ramping up and hiring a significant number of inspectors. There's still a great deal of work to be done and unavoidable bottlenecks in time to be able to do that. Still, they need to, because over inspecting US sites and under inspecting foreign sites leads to the potential for more things to go wrong overseas, that when we finally catch up with them, you discover products have been using a flawed API, or there's nitrosamine contamination, et cetera. As far as additional fees go, that was something that caught my eye in the May executive order, because facilities don't pay fees except for the generic drug user fee amendment, where every finished dosage form and API site that is registered to manufacture any generic product, they pay one of two facility fees, depending if it's FDF or API. Non-US sites under GDUFA pay $15,000 more than US sites do. And that's whether they are 2 miles over the border in Canada or 10,000 miles away in Shanghai. So if there's an executive order to increase the fees that foreign sites pay, we are going into negotiations for the next 5-year period for GDUFA starting this fall. There are 4 major user fee packages with FDA, between FDA and industry. All the user fees get renegotiated every 5 years between the two parties. Then they get authorized by Congress and then passed on to the White House as a law. Prescription drug user fee, PDUFA, which is the innovator side of things, GDUFA, which I've mentioned, BSUFA for biosimilars, and MDUFA for medical devices, all come up in the next year. We are part of the GDUFA negotiations. No negotiating position has been stated yet. We start in the fall. Historically, it takes a while before they get around to talking about the money. It's usually about the commitments on FDA's part, the asks from the industry side, what they can and can't do, how many full-time equivalents it'll take, and then ultimately it gets to the money. My fear, which I've talked about publicly before, is given that executive order, what happens if FDA, driven by HHS and the White House, says that $15,000 foreign differential is now $500,000 for every non-US facility? How does industry respond to that? What effect does that have on if it goes through on what gets manufactured where? Is it 500,000? Is it tiered based on distance from the US or other regional issues, which historically FDA did not want to do? We've brought that up in past GDUFA negotiations. So there's a possibility that there'll be a significant foreign differential change. There may also not be. I may be an alarmist on this stuff, but when I see something in writing from an administration that does what it says it's going to do, I try to figure out what that's going to mean. And the only way you can say foreign facilities will pay more means you increase their facility fees under the only facility or user fee that has facility fees in them. So we'll see if that turns out to be the case. I also spoke at the prescription drug or PDUFA public meetings, just try to reiterate if they look to add a facility fee into PDUFA to also incentivize domestic manufacturing, that could be existentially damaging to the CDMO sector, given how large PDUFA is as a program. What they could do by accident if they tried to make some gigantic fee to push companies away from using non-US sites, that could be very difficult for CDMOs to swallow going forward. So yeah, there's a lot to worry about and to make sure we're staying on top of from a PBOA perspective when it comes to what foreign facilities and US facilities are facing, especially from talking with the FDA and discussing how the user fees are going to progress.
When you mentioned that possibility of the addition of facility fees to PDUFA, why are the stakes so high there particularly?
The amount of money they would want to generate. There are now I'm not a expert on PDUFA. There are aspects of PDUFA when it comes to the size of the program, the costs for individual drug filings for NDAs or BLAs, depending on the type, it can be up to several $1,000,000 just for your drug application. They may want to find other revenue sources to help lower what the application fee is. If facility fees are seen as that alternate revenue source, and if they're going to be large enough to offset and help reduce what the application fees are, then almost by definition, they are going to be so large that CDMOs will not be able to absorb them, or at least the smaller ones. And the way contracts tend to be, you can't go back and say, I know we've got this multi-year contract. We now need to change it so that client X is covering our facility fees. That can be a very difficult argument or discussion to have with customers, depending on the products they have there. So I'm hoping, and I've expressed this to FDA and to the industry side negotiators, that we are very concerned about the possibility of facility fees. Same thing, priorities have not been announced yet. They tend not to come out. They're really held closely between the negotiators of both sides, industry and FDA. But I did try to get our message across that CDMOs having much smaller margins than pharma companies have a lot more at stake from the potential for a significant facility fee. I will note that the whole genesis of PBOA was the GDUFA 1 facility fees, which didn't differentiate between in-house generics and a CDMO, such that if you were Teva with 500 products at one site, or one of my members with one generic product, you were paying the exact same amount, which was over $200,000 per year. So what my negotiating team and I helped fight out was a CDMO carve out, where if a site qualifies as a CDMO, it only pays 1/3 of what that Teva site would pay. With GDUFA 3, that was for GDUFA 2. With GDUFA 3, we lowered that to 24% from 33% because we saw the size of GDUFA overall growing in ways we were not happy with and wanted to make sure that CDMO sites were protected under that sort of potential for expansion. That said, the administration and FDA have made comments that they want to see the user fee programs get smaller. So I don't know what that's going to mean. We're going to find out in a couple of months when negotiations begin. So
Wow.
we'll see.
When will those negotiations begin?
Not officially allowed to say, but sometime this fall is how we're going to phrase it. The Pink Sheet had an article on that somewhat recently. They didn't get the date out of anyone, so I'm not going to give that, even though I got a tentative schedule from FDA a little while ago. So.
Well, going back then to the various initiatives that have been rolled out. So another one was the pre-check program, which was unveiled on August 7th by the FDA, which aims to streamline construction of U.S. drug manufacturing plants by through early communication between the regulators and companies on things like facility design, construction, CMC. Do you think that will move the needle in terms of accelerating bringing more drug manufacturing to the U.S.?
Well, it's something that sort of exists already, which is, um, well, it was a thing. The moment it got announced, I thought that sounds an awful lot like the pre-operational reviews program, and I had to go look that up when it came out, and that began in 2009. So there already is a model in place for FDA to do further engagement with companies as they're building out. Now, whether it's helpful or not, I don't know. I have one member company who engaged in that program while they were building, they were a startup CDMO. They worked with FDA under that, it was FMD 135. That's look it up basically. But again, it was announced in, I think, November 2009. So this company worked with FDA on that early communications program, and they got a lot of great feedback on what they should be doing, making sure that they're building a site that's, bulletproof and will do great when the inspectors come in. And their take was it was sort of overkill. They ended up doing a lot of things that slowed down the process of the actual construction and design to make sure they were satisfying all of these recommendations FDA had given. And it kept them from starting up as a business, being able to tell customers we'll be ready date X, let's get things rolling. The company met a bad fate that was not solely tied to that, but having a few extra months to try to get things going may have helped them stay in business. One of their people told me recently, we could have gotten by not doing everything FDA suggested and fixing some things afterwards when they finally came in for an actual inspection. The big issue with all of this is, as much as they can give that sort of feedback about building out these new sites, there's a catch-22 specifically for CMOs when they're building new operations. And that is FDA cannot come in to inspect your site until there's a drug application referencing the site. And customers with a drug application are really hesitant to go to a site that's never been inspected. So sometimes CMOs get around this not get around this, but their strategy is to go to a company that has an approved generic product, say, and tell them, look, we'll be your second suppliers. You've already got the product approved. This will, trigger an inspection for our site, but it's not putting your product at risk because you're already on the market with it. They might do this with innovator licensed products also, but with generics, there might be a little more room to pull something like this together and be able to get that first inspection. There's still a timeline for FDA to get around to doing that inspection, but once you've had that pre-approval inspection, you can then turn to other customers and say, look, we've been inspected, everything looks good, FDA approved it, we can do real business. It's a catch-22, and there's no way around that unless, as we've recommended to FDA in the past and continue to do, the agency puts together a sort of pre-GMP certification. So beyond this sort of consultation with here's what you should put in for designing, building, et cetera, they have further correspondence with the site. They come to the site. They're able to say at the end of this, look, we cannot guarantee this will pass a pre-approval inspection because legally we can't do that because there's no product being manufactured here. But from everything we've seen, we trust the quality systems. We trust everything they've built and put into place. That is as close as we can come to telling you to tell a customer this site is good to go. Until they put something like that together, it still creates that business uncertainty that leads to this catch-22 situation where CMOs are sometimes building on spec. And that's really there's a lot of millions of dollars are at stake when you do something like that, and it's a lot of time before revenue starts getting generated. So we're hoping the administration listens and understands that, finding some way to facilitate that, to really get FDA in earlier or to get a sort of pre-GMP certification may help really jumpstart domestic manufacturing when it comes to CDMOs.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a huge advance. So another initiative is the Equip a Pharma program, and that's a public-private partnership that's designed to advance drug manufacturing technologies, which in and of itself sounds like a good thing to do. Do you think that the advances that may be developed out of that could significantly reduce the cost of manufacturing here in the United States? Because isn't cost the main reason generic APIs and drugs are produced abroad, as we were discussing earlier?
Yeah, I've seen the program. It's sort of tied to ASPR and Department of Defense. So, I'll put it this way. There was a ASPR workshop in June in Washington where the Segway guy, I'm blanking on his name now, but he's got a number of different technology related businesses. He was going on about this manufacturing equipment they had built that was going to be able to manufacture in individual sites, hospitals generally, and be able to make this product, without having to get it from a factory in another site. You just had the equipment itself, and how FDA's whole regulatory infrastructure isn't built to handle that sort of distributed manufacturing process. They could like inspect the factory that makes the equipment, but then they'd also have to come up with a way of inspecting each and every one of these units that's built and put into a hospital, or find some other way of clearing the entire shebang. That was solely for saline, for, putting saline in bags.
Right.
Now, that's water and salt. And that's complicated enough just from a regulatory side of things. But those are at least two ingredients you can get a hold of. And according to the Segway guy, his the purification equipment, everything else kept everything sterile, makes everything good, but it's saline. So, doing this with different APIs that require different excipients, start with different key starting materials, whether these vending machines basically would have the finished APIs sitting in them, which means you need to go make the API somewhere else and then ship it to each of these sites, which again creates supply chain complexities. It all sounds great. To me, it's always the how do we actually do this? How do you do things when individual components need to be swapped out and changed because certain APIs, if there's any product cross-contamination, will wreck whatever or potentially kill patients who are receiving the other API in their dosage form. Finding out ways to do this that are, again, going to be safe, effective, and not fall into the same problems we have with supply chains. Those are all challenges we need to see how they're going to get circumvented. So,
Wow, a lot of complexity, a lot of issues to take into account. Yeah. So, Gil, thank you so much. I think we should wrap up. Thanks so much for talking to us today and sharing all those insights with our audience.
I didn't even have to talk about tariffs this time. That's great. So,
Maybe we'll talk
I
about
mean,
that next time.
it'll change by the time we finish this. So that's why I don't want to go too deep with where we are on all that. So,
Exactly. I'm sure
but
there's
thank
more.
you so much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
And we're so glad to have you. Thank you.